I have finished Moby Dick. I'm not just talking about the fun and interesting parts of Moby Dick. I have read all 600 pages of this over the course of, I think, about a month. And as you can tell, I'm exhausted. Future me. I cannot hope to be in any way right about this book. I just can't. This book is two simultaneous books going on at once. I can't hope to be right about that. Because on one hand, there is this 250-page novel about a whale hunt. And there's another 250 pages that is about what the fuck this whale means. I am in awe and I am so lost at the same time. Which makes me feel like I'm on the fucking Pequod and I hate it. But that is what is written. There are 1,000 interpretations of this. The easy one to go is, oh, it's a big old metaphor. Great. For what? This book is fascinating beyond belief. There is an old book from either the late 1700s or early 1800s in which someone tried to write America's version of the Odyssey. Now I've heard this story, I don't remember the book, I don't remember the author, I don't even know if it's a true story. But I've heard this story of when American writing was first really trying to find its footing, someone tried to write an American version of the Odyssey, and it failed because it was not in any way. It was just a European voice using American ideals. This is the American Odyssey. This is as close as we're ever going to get to it. This is the book that gives America its own literature voice in the world. This is what gives it. And I just don't know what to say about it. I love this book. I love it. This book is about everything and nothing at the same time. And I love these types of books. We'll get to it. I will get to it eventually. But this feels like the original version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and that entire series. That entire series seems based off of this idea of where there's a story somewhere and there's a whole bunch of underlying and overlying information, and it just drives to some point, but because it's so intermingled and it's just a monster, that it's impossible to know where to go. I can see why people think that this is a bad book. I can see why. Because if you want a story that has a beginning and a middle and an end and has a point and is direct to the point, if you think that that is what a novel should be, this is a terrible book. But if you're willing to explore what 600 pages means, this is a great book. I find it hard to give this a numerical value. This is one of my favorite books that I've read. I ever remember reading. But I think it would be impossible to read this again. Unless I went through and I skipped a whole bunch of stuff. And I went through on my first reading of this, and I did not skip a single thing. I loved it. But it was a monster, and it was a beast. With that being said, I want to give this a 9. I really do. However, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Which is terrible. It puts a lower than Grapes of Wrath in my eyes. But I just don't know if I could read this entire book again. I would have to comb through it and skip over parts. But I want to give it a 9 out of 10 so badly. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I think this is out of the, 12 or 13, however many it is so far out of everything. This is my favorite out of everything that we've read so far. On the book itself, there's so many interpretations and so many important things and so many non-important things that become important. Ishmael is an unreliable narrator. That's maybe the most important thing to know here. Ishmael is a completely unreliable narrator. The biblical references you have to take note of, and you have to at least look it up and see what is going on with these characters and what they mean biblically, but then also what they're doing in the story. I shouldn't say that. There's so many layers to this of what you want to unpack. There's a whole thing in which I just finished reading this, so I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I think there's a whole thing going on with the circles of hell. I really think that there is, and the boats that the Pequot meets. There's a whole bunch of race issues going on. There is a whole bunch of, classism and the workers against the people. Oh, I should say workers against the public, and then workers against their owners, or not their owners, their managers and the owners. The question becomes, what is the question that everyone wants to answer is, what is this whale? I have a tendency to view the whale as nature and the ship in its entirety as humanity, which isn't a great answer, but I'm never going to get it right. I clearly see how the whale can also be representative of God, given all the other biblical references in the novel, and how Ahab and Fadala are considered the devil and his demons. There are some readings of this where people view Ahab as God and the whale as the devil. I find that a little bit harder to see. And maybe that's just because I refuse to read the book as it is. Right, where it's not how the book how it is. It's I refuse to read someone promoting themselves as God and higher than God and then not being smited for it, especially for the years that this was written in. I find it hard to read that way. And I find it hard to take the book at its own level, because throughout the entire time Ahab is constantly calling the whale the devil and the most pure evil in the world, and he has to go and kill it. But we also have an incredibly unreliable narrator. We have, so many other layers to this that I just find it very difficult to believe or to see it in that light. And maybe that'll be different once I go through and do a whole bunch of independent stuff for this. Man, there's just so much. There's just so much of this book. Really, there's the two stories going on here, right? There's the whale and the chasing of the whale, which is the part that everyone's kind of aware of. And then there is Ishmael's story of trying to find himself. He's incredibly introspective throughout the entire novel, no matter what. And it's sometimes jarring. I remember being very, very jarring because you would go through and you did like the first 200 pages all from Ishmael's point of view, and then all of a sudden we get Ahab's point of view, and then we get Starbuck's point of view, and then we get Stubbs' point of view, and then it's a play, and then it's not a play anymore, and we're back to Ishmael, and then we're at an omniscient third-person narrator for a huge chunk of the novel. And the question is, whose fucking story are we looking at here? Because if we are to believe the first line, call me Ishmael, this story of Moby Dick is supposedly being told to the reader by someone who was on the Pequod and surviving member of Pequod. And we get a couple different other stories that kind of revert back to that, of where it's the narrator of Ishmael who is then telling the story, but telling it from a way that he had told it in a different lifetime, or like in previous years. So the question becomes, can we trust Ishmael in the first place, right? There's this whole thing of the prophecy. From what I'm trying to remember from it, and because the prophecy is never told to the reader, which is good. But basically, Fadala tells this prophecy to Ahab. At least I believe it's Fadala that ends up telling this prophecy to Ahab. about, you know, how the eventual death of Moby Dick will come about. And that's why Ahab brings Fedallah on, and hides him as a stowaway. Um, and I think that I feel like the ending line, or the something of it, I think it gets briefly mentioned once, is that the survivor is the one encased in American wood. I feel like there's a whole bunch of references to the importance of American wood in a couple different scenes. Um, and then I think Ahab towards the very end makes sense of it, and I think at the epilogue, Ishmael, whoever Ishmael is, makes the same kind of reference to the importance of American wood. And that's what ends up saving Ishmael in the end, is this bobbing coffin that was used as a life buoy. That's made of American wood, right? The other important, I guess, the other note that I have off the top of my head is I briefly mentioned all these biblical characters for this, and there's a lot of them, right? It's our prophets. All of our prophets are named biblical names except for Pip. And the question becomes why? Why in the world are all of our prophets? The first one we meet is Elijah, out in Nantucket. Then we meet Gabriel, who's on Parabome, I believe. Then there's another one. I think there's a third one. And there's Pip. And then even Ahab, at some point he makes reference to, not only does he have to be the prophecy maker, but the maker of prophecies. I think that's what he says. It's something along those lines, in which we get the idea that, number one, there's a prophecy that he's somehow trying to commit, but also he's now enforcing it and making it happen, right? And then even Ishmael. I think Ishmael is a prophet in some way, and with the uncertainty of our narrator and the fact that all of our other narrators are biblically named, I think there's certainly room for speculation that Ishmael and Pip are actually the same character. And you know, I only have thoughts on that with just remembering what the book is like. But Ishmael gets paid an incredibly low wage, way lower than any white person would have earned on a ship, even if they were just a rower. He is incredibly attached to Queequeg, who is the only other black man or black person featured in this entire thing. No, scratch that me. He is incredibly attached to Queequeg, who's really the only other person of color that we really dive into, right? There's Dagu, and there is Teshtigo, who are also people of color, but they're not, like, they're very service level characters. And there's becomes a lot of similarity in the ways that, like, what is described of what Pip does and what is described of what Ishmael does in the epilogue really draws similarities between the two. I'm sure I could fathom some other connections if I want to look for certain things. But yeah. Moby Dick is an incredibly fascinating book, and I think deserves the longest video up to this point. I give this a 9 out of 10. I think this is an absolutely fantastic book. However, I don't recommend that you read it the way that I did. I would recommend viewing this as 2 separate books. There's a book about the Odyssey, or about the fighting of the whale, and there's a book about the emotional dive that Ishmael takes. I assume there's a list somewhere online of where someone's done this, and separate those chapters. And I would read one section of chapters, and then I would read the second section of chapters as 2 separate books. Because that might be a better way to go about making sense of this, instead of trying to read this all in one go. 600 pages. It's a long one, but I love this. This is great. I would never teach this, and I don't recommend reading it the way that I did, but this is just a beautiful work of everything and nothing.